We went through a lot. This will be the last chapter we go over before you take your final. So I'm planning on going over nutrition assessment today, and then we'll probably take a break after that, and we'll come back. I will give you a test review for your final exam for this class. So we will not cover chapters 34 and 35. This is the last chapter we cover over nutrition assessment.
Yes, sir.
So, first thing about nutrition assessment, remember there's all the information is in detail as far as the PowerPoints and all of that. I looked at that this morning. It goes along a little bit with today's lecture, but I've got to kind of correlate nutrition assessment with what you guys will actually be doing in clinicals. A lot of the different testing, because we're the ones running the test to determine if someone may be malnourished anywhere. Okay, so we've got to go through and determine what population groups are at risk for malnutrition and all of that. That's one of your objectives today, is list the groups that are in danger of being malnourished in any way. Okay, I looked through the chapter on this, and for whatever reason, I don't think that objective is covered in this chapter, even though that's an objective. So you may want to write some of these down, okay? But we're going to go, the first thing we're going to talk about is who are the groups that are in danger of malnutrition, all right? So
Children,
what do you
elderly.
guys think? What would be some groups that come to mind of people that you would think
The elderly.
possibly could be in danger of that? Darren?
Third world countries?
I'm with that, but I want to know specific groups.
Children.
Right, third world countries.
Southeast Asia?
I mean
Like the elderly.
I mean like more
Children,
like
elderly people.
population groups, not necessarily location groups.
Yeah.
Okay, newborns. I heard
Yeah.
newborns. All right, that's a good one. Newborns.
I would think that children like below the age of 5 in general,
Let's go. Who else?
like elderly children.
Elderly.
Yeah.
All right.
Children?
All right.
Yeah.
We'll go with newborns, elderly. Now let's get a little bit more specific. When we're talking about elderly, what population groups, like if you, let's think of something, let's go with nursing home patients, maybe?
People that are like
You're not gonna have to know
immunosuppressed.
every one of these that we're gonna write down, but again, it's just population groups that may be at risk.
Like people that have immunosuppressed, like people with AIDS and I don't know.
Good, that's what I've got. That's one of the other resources I went to. Cancer patients, patients that are taking chemotherapy, patients that are taking radiation. Okay, so oncology, in other words. Let's think about people that really can't communicate well. They
Like-
can't tell you when they're hungry.
Comatose?
What's
Oh.
that?
Comatose people?
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
or dementia. I mean, I guess it kind of goes with
Mentally
nursing.
ill.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mentally disabled. This is a train wreck.
What about someone that has had a
Stroke.
stroke victims? Okay. Now, those are all good ones, but there are some other things that we need to think about as far as what about certain things that happen to you during life to where maybe you require more vitamins or things like that than other times.
Pregnancy.
Pregnancy.
What about homeless people?
I'll go with that.
Yeah.
Immunocompromised?
Okay, immunocompromised, that'd be good. I think that can go a little bit along with oncology.
Okay.
Now, one of the things that we don't think about, I had a discussion with my family about this last night actually, are going to be the socioeconomic areas of people's lives, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
People that don't have a lot, and not necessarily from a financial standpoint. One thing that's happening more and more is that, I mean, you guys may not agree with this, but not everybody knows how to cook anymore. A long time ago, people used to cook all the time. I mean, families used to sit down, believe it or not, every day. My family doesn't, okay, anymore. But I just know when I was a kid, my mom made supper, pretty much every night, okay? And so a lot of that went with, we were adequately fed. Anymore, it's not like that. People live out of microwaves. I live out of a microwave now. I'll eat lunch out of a microwave today.
Or
What
McDonald's.
I brought, I'm gonna warm something up, right?
Yeah.
What about
McDonald's.
Yeah.
Fast
What's that?
food.
drug
Fast-
addicts?
Drug addicts, yes, I don't have that one listed, but I agree with that, drug addicts.
Yeah. But yeah, my boyfriend was raised on McDonald's, so.
Yeah.
Because his mom didn't know how to cook, so it's just.
Well, do you
McDonald's
guys not
every day.
agree a little bit of a way, and again, I'm not trying to convince you of what's right or what's wrong, but do you not agree that it is starting to kind of seem like you can go to McDonald's, you can buy a large Coke for $1,
You
Right.
can. You
but
can.
if you are to try to buy a salad from McDonald's, okay, something that's
It's
healthy.
$7-8 bucks.
Okay,
And those
It's a lot
salads
more
aren't
expensive.
healthy either.
I think it sells at my job like $10-11 and it sounds like $8.
It's like
Like,
my pizza
Yeah.
stick over here.
yeah,
Yeah.
I need some cheese.
yeah, exactly.
The only thing we've got are gonna
We
be
ate lunch at Bubba Brews the other day, and my wife got a big salad, and, she only told me, I didn't even pay attention to what it cost when we were eating it, but when we were talking about this last night, she let me know that salad was like $18.
Whoa.
Well, she got a big one, okay? But what I got wasn't $18, I got, I
Chicken
told you guys,
strips.
I ate horrible, I got the chicken strips and fries, okay? And that was cheaper than my wife's salad was.
That's
But
great.
anyway, I'm just trying to get the point across that sometimes in society, it seems like as time goes on, it's like we're promoting unhealthy habits because it's cheaper
It's
to eat that way.
convenient.
So now you combine that with people that are on a limited budget. If you go to McDonald's and you've got $5 to spend, okay, you're gonna live off that dollar menu, right? Or you might. All right, now I live off of it because I like what's on the dollar. Okay? But a lot of people, they're not in that situation.
It's a
okay?
financial.
But it is very expensive to eat healthy, anymore, and it goes the same when you go to grocery stores or anything like that, okay? So that's something we need to think about when we're talking about this today, okay? Okay, so this chapter starts on page 662 to 663.
I think so. I haven't used it.
On page 663, it says the nutrition care process is defined as a systemic problem-solving method that dietetic professionals use to critically think and make decisions to address nutrition-related problems and provide safe and effective quality nutrition care. Okay, so we are not gonna be dietitians in this room, guys, okay? And so there's some parts of this chapter, I want you to read it, but at the same point, I'm gonna let you know what I feel like is a real important, okay, as far as what we directed toward lab. Now, there is something on further down in this column called a body mass index, okay? You do need to be aware of that, okay? Basically, body mass index, it has to do with a person's height and their weight, and they determine what's good and what's bad. Now, what you need to worry about on body mass index, there's certain lab values that we have talked about through previous lectures that have to do, maybe not with a body mass index, but with a body surface area. What's one of the tests we talked about where you guys had to do a calculation? Anybody remember it off the body surface area? What'd you say?
Blood creatinine?
Creatinine
Oh,
clearance.
yeah, 'cause
Okay,
you have
so
to know
that's
their
close
weight.
enough. But remember, I told you guys that when you're working in the lab and you have to do a creatinine clearance, it is not going to let you result that. You're gonna have to know what the serum creatinine is and the urine creatinine. But if the nursing personnel have not put in that patient's height and their weight, it will not let you calculate that creatinine clearance, okay? So that's something that you can associate with a body mass index. I know now, I think some of the schools, I know when my kids were young, like first through the 8th grade, they would send notes home with my children telling me that they were, according to their body mass index, they were overweight, okay? Yeah, I question some of those values too. My son got that sent home sometimes and they claimed he was overweight. I thought more he was underweight than overweight. Do they still do that? Any of your kids getting those notes sent home with them about their body mass index?
My kid did until he went to the private school don't go, but I think it's the public school or friends still does it.
Yeah, most still do it.
They started that, I think, when I was in the 10th grade over in Malvern.
Really?
Everybody
And
got
they-
these
Yes.
board?
And
Okay.
Stopped doing it to my sister when she hit about 4th grade. That's the last time she got anything.
Oh, so
Sent home saying
Hunter's
she
in.
was obese.
Well-
Like, whatever. I was like, take it with a grain of salt.
Yeah, I don't really like it simply because it was telling our athletes that they were obese,
Yeah.
but it's just muscle weight.
Right.
Whereas, like, some people, they were like, well, you're critically underweight, so you need to eat. And these are people that ate way more than everyone else. They just had a very high metabolism. So,
Okay, so, moving on, nutrition has to do, the book is gonna talk about in the right-hand column, it's gonna break this down into what's called macronutrients and micronutrients, alright? So when we talk about macronutrients, alright, these are the larger things that we consume, alright? Macronutrients are gonna consist of things like carbohydrates, proteins, and fats, right? And as we go through this lecture today, we're gonna emphasize the importance of each one of those, okay? Basically, guys, when we talk about carbohydrates, what's the main carbohydrate that comes to mind? As soon as we say the word carbohydrate.
bread.
Sugar, okay? Like the Atkins diet, right? You don't wanna eat anything that basically breaks down into sugar or glucose. Now, how you guys are gonna correlate that in the laboratory is when we test for carbohydrates, we are usually, okay, the major carbohydrate we're testing for is what the problem is with diabetic patients. Their
Glucose.
glucose value, okay? And if you think about it, that correlates with nutrition because diabetics, all right, they have to watch their diet big time, okay? Whether you're type 1 or type 2. Remember, if they don't follow that diet that their physician or their nurse gives them, they have to worry about long-term chronic problems like diabetic nephropathy, right? Where the kidneys are damaged due to them not following their diet. So that's the major thing that you have to watch out for generally about the carbohydrates. Now, when we talk about protein today, that's one of the things that they like to test for if they feel like somebody is malnourished, okay? What's the major protein we've talked about in this class that makes up half of all the proteins in your body? What's it called?
Albumin.
Albumin,
I
okay?
only know it's my blood.
All right, albumin is something that they can test for, and guys, everything I'm telling you about is in your reading, okay? But that is something that they can test for to determine if someone is malnourished, is if they have a low albumin level. The problem with albumin is the half-life of albumin is 20 days, okay? So because of that, such a long half-life, that person is really gonna be malnourished before they can figure that out simply by an albumin test. There are other proteins that are better when you're trying to test for malnutrition. One of them is an analyte called prealbumin, all right, or transthyretin. I think that's what the book is gonna call it, is transthyretin, but I think I've taught it to you guys as being prealbumin levels.
That's a little spike before the big.
Yep, that's the spike before albumin on serum protein electrophoresis. Your book's also gonna mention things like retinol binding protein. It's gonna mention transferrin. Remember transferrin? What's the function of transferrin? The carrier of iron, right? So those are some proteins that they use to check a patient's nutritional status. When you read over albumin, it's going to tell you that that's a great thing to test for, but again, you've gotta watch out for that half-life. There's a reason that I'm specifically telling you that, okay? So make sure that you remember the half-life of albumin is a long time, and there are other proteins that can better detect malnutrition than albumin levels. Okay, so we've covered the proteins and we've covered the carbohydrates, and the one other thing that makes up the macronutrients is your lipids, okay, or your fats, right? Now, generally, when we're talking about malnutrition, when we're talking about fats, we're worried about excess. We're not necessarily worried about not enough of, okay? Remember when we broke down fats into lipids, and I told you there's good cholesterol, there's bad cholesterol, and all of that? When you do a lipid profile, I think it talks about these fats, guys, if you want to stay with me on page 667 in the right-hand column. When we test for fats, usually a physician is gonna order a lipid panel. And in that lipid panel, they're gonna test for cholesterol, they're gonna test for triglycerides, and then basically when they do that total cholesterol test, if that result is high, okay, they're gonna be looking at your HDL and your LDL values, okay? Remember, the good is the HDL and the bad is the LDL. So that's one of the things that they're going to look at. You have a high total cholesterol. What you don't wanna have is you don't wanna have a low HDL level, okay? HDL is the good, and so if that result, if anything, you want it to be elevated. All right, another objective talks about parenteral nutrition. That's abbreviated as PN, or sometimes it's called TPN, total parenteral nutrition, and that's at the bottom of page 667 in your textbook. Everybody with me? It's a blue bolded word there. It says parenteral nutrition is a means of intense nutritional support for patients who are malnourished or in danger of becoming malnourished because they are unable to take any nutrients when their gut doesn't work. PN therapy involves administering appropriate amounts of carbs, proteins or amino acids and lipid solutions, as well as electrolytes, vitamins, minerals, and trace elements to meet the caloric, protein, and nutrient requirements while maintaining water and electrolyte balance. So I think that covers the macronutrient side of it, and that should be pretty easy for you guys to remember because we've covered all of these different things in various chapters preceding this. But the one thing we have not really covered up until now is when we're talking about micronutrients. The book talks about micronutrients have to do with where patients kind of straddle the fence between health and sickness, okay? And when we're talking about micronutrients, we're talking about things that the body needs, but they need in smaller amounts. So we're talking about things like vitamins, minerals, electrolytes, things like that, okay? So we're gonna talk about vitamins today. And it talks about vitamins on page 668 in the right-hand column. About halfway down in the right-hand column on 668, it says vitamins have a wide range of functions in biological tissue, serving as cofactors in many enzymatic reactions, so that these enzymes have low catalytic activity in cellular reactions if vitamins are not present. These compounds and their biologically inactive precursors must be partially obtained from food sources and in some instances from bacterial synthesis. Can anybody remember from the summer which vitamin can you get about half of all that you need just from bacterial production? Vitamin K. You guys remember us talking about that? Intestinal bacteria will produce about 50% of all the vitamin K that you need. Now we're going to talk about vitamin K today and we'll go over that, but I was hoping you guys can recall that information. Now there's another one we're going to talk about today that can be produced from bacteria as well, and that's called folate, right? There's going to be some vitamins that we'll test for in the lab. Usually they go hand in hand, B12, folate. If you ever get a tube sent down to the lab, usually those two vitamins will be together. Okay, on page 669, left-hand column, first full paragraphs, it says, for simplicity, vitamins of diverse chemical structure are classified as either water-soluble or fat-soluble. It says fat-soluble vitamins includes vitamins A, vitamins D, vitamins E, and vitamin K. If you need a mnemonic for that, ADEC. That's how I remembered it when I first had to go with the fat-soluble vitamins. Okay, so you need to know the difference between fat-soluble and water-soluble. So the next thing it says is it says those vitamins soluble in water include the B complex of vitamins. This is going to be things like thiamine, riboflavin, niacin, vitamins B6, vitamins B12, folate, and vitamin C. Also goes on to state that water-soluble vitamins are readily excreted in the urine and are less likely than fat-soluble vitamins to accumulate to toxic levels in the body. You can, and some people that take lots of vitamins, you can take too many vitamins and they can actually become toxic. But what the book is trying to tell you is those vitamins that are excreted every day in the urine are going to have less of a chance of becoming toxic than say a fat soluble vitamin, all right, that's stored in the fatty tissue or in the liver. Those are the ones that can become toxic. Now, there is a very good chart, guys, as a study guide for your test. We're gonna go through each one of these vitamins, and I'm gonna highlight what's important, or what I think that you really need to know about those vitamins. But table 33, tac 2, at the bottom of page 669, it lists all the vitamins, and it tells you what disease states go along with the clinical deficiency. Okay, so as far as studying for your test, this would be a good chart to look at. All right, so we're gonna start off with the fat-soluble vitamins first. First one's gonna be vitamin A. Anybody know anything, what's the first thing does anybody just already know the first thing that comes to mind about vitamin A? What it has to do with? Vision. Okay, I'm on page 669, right-hand column, halfway down on vitamin A. It says retinol and retinoic acid are derived directly from dietary sources, primarily as retinol esters, or from metabolism of dietary carotenoids, primarily beta-carotene. You'll skip down a few lines. It says that vitamin A and related retinoic acids are a group of compounds essential for vision. Now, it also mentions cellular differentiation, growth, reproduction, immune system function. It says a clearly defined physiologic role of retinol is vision. And then toward the end of that column, it states that vitamin A deficiency. Now, when you study these, I'm real interested in if you are deficient in a vitamin, and then I'll point out those ones that have toxicities. It says vitamin A deficiency leads to night blindness. And when prolonged, it may cause total blindness. So always think about vision. I think when you take your registry, if they ask you anything about vitamin A deficiency, the answer to that is going to be vision or night blindness. Okay, on page 670, you'll look at the first full paragraph. It says, when ingested in high doses, either chronically or acutely, vitamin A causes many toxic manifestations and may ultimately lead to liver damage due to hypervitaminosis. Now, on further down in this paragraph, and guys, this is real important for you to remember. Generally, when you're working in the lab, you know how all these tests that we do, they're usually written on the barcode that's on the tube of blood, right? Like, for example, if you're doing a proton, you know exactly what you're doing. But one thing that's kind of weird about vitamins, they don't necessarily, the test is not called the vitamin, for example. It's called something else because it's either a metabolite or a byproduct of that vitamin, right? So, when you test for vitamin A, it says, I'm about 4 or 5 lines up from that paragraph we're in. It says, measurement of retinol is the most common means of assessing vitamin A status in the clinical setting. It says retinol is most commonly measured by high performance liquid chromatography. So when we run that test, we are going to be utilizing an analyzer that is using some sort of a chromatography method to detect retinol. I remember working in the lab, and we used to get this test all the time, okay? But it wouldn't say vitamin A, it would be retinol. But that is used to determine if that patient is deficient in vitamin A. And this won't be the only one that has a different name for the particular vitamin that you're testing for. Okay, the next fat-soluble vitamin that we need to go over is vitamin E. This is the next one on page 670 in the left-hand column. You'll go down about to the 6th line. It says the role of vitamin E in protecting the erythrocyte membrane from oxidant stress is presently its major documented role in human physiology. So when it says the word erythrocyte, it's talking about a red blood cell, right? The red blood cell membrane. So if you're deficient in vitamin E, your red cell membranes, they're fragile. In other words, they can be broken. And if the red cell membrane can be broken, what does that lead to? Anemia, right? So patients can become anemic if they have a vitamin E deficiency. Okay, if you'll skip 3 lines, and this is important, make sure you have this noted. It says the generic name for vitamin E is tocopherol, which includes several biologically active isomers of vitamin E. So that's the test that physicians order. You won't see it as vitamin E, it'll be tocopherol. It's what we test for down in the lab. The very last paragraph in the left-hand column on page 670 is where it tells you the major symptom of vitamin E deficiency is hemolytic anemia. All right, that's very important, hemolytic anemia. And vitamin E is one of those vitamins that really does not produce toxic effects. And it tells you that in your reading. It says, although megadoses of vitamin E do not produce toxic effects, high doses have no proven health benefit. So the more vitamin E you take, it isn't going to make your red blood cell membranes tougher. Okay, the next vitamin. Now this is one we talked a lot about in a previous chapter, so this one should be pretty easy for you. It's going to be vitamin D, right? Vitamin D refers to a group of related metabolites used for proper skeleton formation and mineral balance. Do you guys remember when we covered the chapter on calcium? And we talked about vitamin D production. Remember, the whole point of vitamin D is as long as you have a sufficient amount of vitamin D, it allows your body to absorb calcium. Okay? Now, if you'll remember, we talked a lot about that. Okay? So your calcium level is totally dependent on whether or not you have enough vitamin D in your body. Because there's a mechanism that exists to where as long as you have adequate vitamin D, it allows your body to absorb calcium. If you don't have enough vitamin D, you can take all the calcium supplements you want, but your body won't absorb calcium. So calcium and vitamin D go hand in hand on that. Okay, the last paragraph on page 670, you'll go down to the 3rd line in the last paragraph. It states major dietary sources of vitamin D include irradiated foods and commercially prepared milk. Now, what is another source of vitamin D that we talked about in that chapter on calcium? Sunlight. Okay, you get about half the vitamin D you need from just being exposed to sunlight. You guys remember when we talked about you're exposed to sunlight, okay, and that gives you, I think it was called vitamin D3, and remember there was an enzyme in the liver that converted it to
vitamin D4.
25-hydroxy vitamin D. You remember that?
Yeah.
Because I told you guys, I said that is the one blood test they test for when they're wanting to know vitamin D status. It's called 25-hydroxy vitamin D. That's the blood test you will do. Now, that's still not the active form of vitamin D. Remember, 25-hydroxy vitamin D is the storage form of vitamin D, right? But that's what we use to test for it. But remember, there's one more enzyme in the kidney, all right, that has to convert 25-hydroxy vitamin D into the active metabolite of vitamin D.
Which is like 1.
And it states that in your reading. It tells you the active metabolite of vitamin D. It's called 1,25-D-hydroxy vitamin D. And you guys have answered that on a test question, remember?
Yes, I do.
Okay, at the top of page 671, if you'll go down to about the 3rd line, it says severe deficiency in children causes a failure to calcify cartilage at the growth plate and bone formation, leading to the development of rickets. And you guys have had that key term. Rickets is a vitamin D deficiency in children, whereas remember a vitamin D deficiency in adults is called what?
Osteoporosis.
Osteomalacia. Good. You can have a problem with too much vitamin D if you guys are still with me in the reading, if you'll drop down about 7 lines, it says excess vitamin D produces hypercalcemia and hypercalciuria, which can lead to calcium deposits in the soft tissue and irreversible kidney and cardiac damage.
Those hurt.
What's that?
So those hurt. Had some.
Okay, so I feel pretty confident that you guys will be pretty strong on vitamin D, but make sure that you go over the vitamin A and the vitamin E. Now, this last fat soluble vitamin, you're gonna have to remember all the way back from the summer, but we talked about it, vitamin K, all right? This is the last fat soluble vitamin we'll talk about. I'm in the left-hand column on 671. Vitamin K, and I didn't know that, I was actually reading over this last night and I forgot, this comes from the German word meaning coagulation, but they spell coagulation with a K, okay, not a C. It says this is a group of substances essential for the formation of prothrombin. Does anybody remember what coagulation factor prothrombin is on the coagulation cascade?
No.
2?
Good. Factor 2 is called prothrombin. Says it's also responsible for at least 5 other coagulation proteins, including 7, 9, and 10, as well as protein C and protein S. Remember in the summer, I told you, I mean, you've been tested on it, but remember I told you, you have to remember the vitamin K dependent coagulation factors. It will always be factors 2, 7, 9, and 10, as well as protein C and protein S. Okay? So in other words, if you're low in vitamin K, if you can just remember that, that will tell you then more than likely you're gonna have a tendency to bleed, right? Because if you don't have coagulation factors, that causes a tendency of bleeding to occur in the body. If you'll skip down about 6 or 7 lines, it says that vitamin K is produced by intestinal bacteria. This production provides 50% of the vitamin K requirement. It says major dietary sources are cabbage, cauliflower, spinach, and other leafy vegetables, pork, liver, soybeans, and vegetable oils. So I hope my bacteria is working good because I'm not taking that in. All right?
Sure he gets
On page
vegetables.
672, it says that vitamin K deficiency may be caused by antibiotic therapy. Now let's talk about that. Remember us talking about in the summer that that's one reason they tell moms and dads like it's not a good idea to constantly be taking antibiotics, because if antibiotics kill all of your normal flora, right, in your intestines, well, if you're taking antibiotics all the time, these people can actually be vitamin K deficient simply because they're constantly taking antibiotics. So sometimes we need to go ahead and maybe let that sickness kind of cure itself, let our body do what it's supposed to do and keep that normal flora, okay? Because that normal flora, vitamin K is not the only thing that bacteria is good for, but that is a great example of that.
Cause that's how you get C. diff too, right, when you kill all that off?
Yes. Since you bring that up, there was something that happened when I was just leaving St. Joe when I worked there where, and I know this was true, but there was something going on, and I think it was about C. diff, where one of the treatments is they were actually injecting stool
Yeah, someone
into
else's.
people to treat that.
Yeah, they take a healthy person's and put it in them, and it
But anyway, that's
everything
just a side note, we'll be
repopulates.
tested on that. Okay.
They had a whole South Park.
Okay, it says when vitamin K antagonists such as warfarin are used for anticoagulant therapy, anticoagulant factors 2, 7, 9, and 10 are produced, but they will be non-functional. Goes on to say an apparent vitamin K deficiency may lead to bleeding episodes or may result when anticoagulants such as warfarin, sodium are used. So there are a lot of people in the hospital that are taking Coumadin or warfarin. So if you think about it, what it does is it inhibits your vitamin K production. If it inhibits your vitamin K production, it's going to affect those factors 2, 7, 9, and 10. remember, people that are taking, Coumadin or warfarin, those are blood thinners, right? So it's, those people are prone to clot, so they're trying to keep their blood, I try to make it sound like, as liquid as possible, okay? It makes it, their blood really, really thin. But those people sometimes have to take vitamin K. So people that are taking Coumadin and warfarin, I know my mom has to take that, and you know, if they bang themselves or if they hit something a little too hard, you'll start seeing those bruises develop just underneath the skin, okay? So you know how that works now. That's how Coumadin and warfarin works, is it basically is an antagonist against vitamin K. But, you know, again, there's side effects to a lot of drugs that you have to take, and unfortunately, that's one of them when you take Coumadin or warfarin. Okay, the last paragraph under vitamin K says that toxicity from vitamin K is not commonly seen in adults. Large doses in infants may result in hyperbilirubinemia. Now, this is one thing that, and I don't think it actually says this in the reading, but when babies are born, they are given a vitamin K shot to prevent the possibility of bleeding. So I guess this is meaning that maybe if they give them too much vitamin K, but all babies, as far as I know, Diane, you may be able to help me out with that, are all newborn babies given that vitamin K shot?
Yes, but parents can refuse, but by law, we're supposed to do that.
Okay. So that's a population that they do give vitamin K, and that answers another one of your objectives that talks about, you know, certain populations that are in need of certain vitamins more than others, and so newborns. And I think from what I was reading in another book, it stated that especially premature newborns, right? But it is state law that they be given vitamin K. Okay, probably the most important thing that you guys will run into that I want you to remember on this, if you'll go down just a couple of lines from where we just were, it says, in most labs, vitamin K is not assayed. There is not a test for vitamin K. The test they do instead is a PT, or a prothrombin time. This is used as a functional indicator of vitamin K status. So basically, and it'll tell you this in your reading, your pro time should be between 11 and 15 seconds, okay? So if they think somebody is deficient in vitamin K, what they're gonna do is a pro time or a PT. If that PT is elevated, then they are going, if the patient has symptoms for a vitamin K deficiency, they are going to assume that they're lacking vitamin K, all right? There are about 3 different reasons they do a pro time test in the hospital. Now again, guys, I'm talking back from the summer. I know it's been a long time ago. They do a pro time if a patient's taking Coumadin or warfarin to monitor that. But they can also do a pro time if they're worried about a patient that is deficient in vitamin K. And about the only other reason that they'll do that pro time is if they think a person is having liver failure or they have liver damage, they'll also do a pro time, okay? But if a person is vitamin K deficient, remember those factors, because you will be asked this on the registry. 2, 7, 9, and they always put them in Roman numerals. I wish they wouldn't. These are the vitamin K dependent factors. But if a person is truly vitamin K deficiency, not only will their pro time be elevated, but so will their PTT. Remember the partial thromboplastin time?
Yep.
Because remember, that coagulation cascade, it's been a long time, but remember there's an extrinsic pathway and an intrinsic pathway. Well, remember, the extrinsic pathway is monitored by the pro time, but that intrinsic pathway is gonna involve 9, okay? And remember, 2 is in the common pathway. So because of that, both of your coagulation assays, your pro time and your PTT, will both be elevated if a person truly is vitamin K deficient. But when you're talking about adults, don't forget that bacteria, your normal flora, will produce about 50% of the vitamin K needed. Okay, so that takes care of the fat-soluble vitamins. So now we're gonna move on to the water-soluble vitamins. The first one we're gonna talk about is thiamine, or vitamin B1. Now, on this one, guys, if you'll drop down to about the fourth line in that paragraph, it states the clinical condition associated with chronic thiamine deficiency is a, condition called beriberi. And you may not know what beriberi means, but beriberi, as far as the population that I did the research on that's most affected, is like, over in Vietnam and Asian countries and places like that where they eat lots of rice, okay? Rice is really, really high in vitamin B1, and because they eat so much rice, the problem with it is you would think, well, they're probably getting too much vitamin B1, right? But that rice goes through a milling process, and when it goes through that milling process, it's taking off that outer layer of the rice. That's the part that contains the vitamin B1. So because they eat so much rice and it's went through the milling process, these people are more likely to get this condition beriberi than say we are in the United States. It's because they eat so much rice and it's been through that milling process. Riboflavin, this is an example of vitamin B2. About the only thing of interest on the vitamin B2, if you go to the right-hand column up toward the top, you drop down about 5 lines, it states that riboflavin deficiency occurs with other nutritional deficiencies. Also, alcoholism and chronic diarrhea and malabsorption syndromes can all cause deficiencies of vitamin B2. Another one of the B vitamins is called niacin, which is vitamin B3. Everybody with me in the right-hand column under niacin? You'll go down to that second paragraph toward the bottom. The condition that goes with a vitamin B3 deficiency is called pellagra. It says the clinical syndrome resulting from niacin deficiency is associated with diarrhea, dementia, dermatitis, and death. That's for vitamin B3. I don't remember testing for these types of these offset vitamins like B3 and B1. I don't remember getting those tests ordered very often, okay? So that's the reason I'm kind of being short on those. I'm gonna spend more time, like for example, talking about the next one, which is gonna be folate, okay? Folate, you will get that test ordered a lot. And again, it usually comes down to the lab as being ordered as vitamin B12/folate. Okay, so under folate, drop down about 8 or 9 lines and it says large quantities of folate are produced or synthesized by bacteria in the colon. So this is another one that can be produced naturally in the body. The very last sentence in that paragraph, well, actually go up a couple of lines from the very last sentence. It says food folates are primarily found in green leafy vegetables, fruits, organ meats, and yeast. Something else that I think is pretty interesting about that is it states that boiling food and using large quantities of water result in folate destruction. It says the average American diet may be inadequate in folate for adolescents and for pregnant or lactating women. Now, as far as what we will see in the lab, I'm hoping you guys can recall this from the summer a little bit. It says the major clinical symptom of a folate deficiency is a condition called megaloblastic anemia. It says as far as the lab testing or laboratory indices of deficiencies are, it says you will have a low serum folate level, hypersegmentation of neutrophils. You guys remember us showing you the hypersegmented neutrophil? That's one thing that we will see when we're doing the differential of someone that has megaloblastic anemia, is inside those neutrophils, that nucleus, instead of having 2 or 3 lobes, it may have more than 5. Now again, guys, you're never gonna make that decision. You're never gonna call the doctor and say, hey, this person has megaloblastic anemia. But it is real important to note that when you're doing the manual differential, it's real important that you know, look, some of these segmented neutrophils that we're seeing have hypersegmentation. It also states that you will see macroovalocytes. So what is a macroovalocyte? Yeah, it's a real large red cell, okay? You know what a normal red cell looks like. We've talked about that. And the big difference between a megaloblastic anemia and, say, iron deficient anemia is you're gonna see real little red cells, and they're gonna be hypochromic. They're not gonna have much redness to the cell, right? Because the person's having trouble carrying oxygen, right? But in megaloblastic anemia, even though it's still an anemia and their H&H is gonna be low, the red cells are big, all right? So that's one of the big differences, and you'll see those hypersegmented neutrophils. All right, next paragraph says folate requirement is increased during pregnancy and especially during lactation. Says the increase during lactation results in part from the presence of high affinity folate binders that are in milk. It also says dietary supplementation of folate in pregnant women reduces the incidence of fetal neural tube defects. I think that that's something that they may ask you. If they ask you anything about folate, that's one thing they want you to watch out for, is they claim, I think that that's a test that's done in prenatal workups, is they're testing for folate. Remember, we talked about that. Remember, what other tests are they testing in the prenatal workup? 3 letters, we talked about it. In microscopy, it also is used to detect neural tube defects.
Oh, we just talked about it.
Alpha
Protein.
protein, right? That's another test that they do. So if you are a mom expecting, you can pretty much bet if you're having prenatal workups done, that they are going to do, they're gonna make sure that you're taking folate, all right? And they're gonna probably do an alpha fetoprotein test. And we talked about what happens if that alpha fetoprotein is abnormal. What's the next thing that they might do? Amniocentesis, right? It doesn't always mean something bad, but if your alpha fetoprotein is high, that's neural tube defects, and unfortunately, if it's low, does anybody remember that?
Spinal.
Spina bifida is a
Yeah.
neural tube defect, but if your alpha fetoprotein is low, sometimes they have to worry about Downs.
Oh, yeah, Downs.
Okay, for folate, it states that there are no known cases of folate toxicity, so that's not one. Again, guys, remember your water-soluble vitamins, they're not generally gonna be toxic because you're excreting those out in the urine every day. But because of that, you're gonna be more apt to have to take your water-soluble vitamins every day than you are your fat-soluble vitamins. Okay, guys, I'm about halfway in the right-hand column on page 673. It says folate levels may be measured in serum using, now it talks about a microbiologic assay using lactobacillus. I don't want you to put that. I want you to highlight competitive binding protein assay. That's the method they use to measure folate, is a competitive protein binding assay. Now, you will do that on an automated analyzer, but that is how that test is performed. Now, we talked about that stuff, guys, remember in serology, all the competitive binding and all of that. But one of your objectives is for some of these different vitamins that we're testing for, they want to know what is the methodology for how we test for that. All right, vitamin B12. And you guys have heard of that one before, right? That's kind of a common one. I'm on page 674, vitamin B12 right at the top up there. If you go down to the second sentence, it says intestinal absorption of vitamin B12 takes place in the ileum and is mediated by a unique binding protein called intrinsic factor, which is secreted by the stomach. That is very, very important. most people, if they are not getting an adequate amount of vitamin B12, something that always has to be thought about is, are they lacking that substance called intrinsic factor? Here's the deal with that. You can take in all the B12 you want, but if you don't have intrinsic factor in your gut, okay, it won't allow your body to absorb vitamin B12. Now, because of that, okay, and that is very common, I mean, I'm not saying it's common, but of the people that have a B12 deficiency, a lot of times this is the case, and this is gonna be those people that possibly have to take vitamin B12 shots, okay, because the intrinsic factor is not allowing it to be taken up naturally.
Doesn't doesn't K and intrinsic factor have something to do with each other?
No,
It's
everything out
K.
of red is intrinsic factor has to do with vitamin B12.
I don't see.
Okay, drop down a little further in that paragraph. It says the primary dietary sources for vitamin B12 are from animal products. These are gonna be things like meat, eggs, and milk. It does say, therefore, a total vegetarian diets are likely to be deficient or low in vitamin B12. Now, I think there are some sources of vitamin B12 other than animal products, but they're few. Darren, I'm not trying to put you on the spot, but can you tell us, because I know that you don't eat meat, right?
That is correct.
So how are you getting your vitamin B12?
Supplements, pills.
That you're taking in the pill form then?
Yes, sir.
All right, so this condition that I told you about that is real common where you lack the intrinsic factor, the condition, there's a term for this, and it's called pernicious anemia. All right, I'm in the left-hand column, go all the way down to the very last line of the left-hand column. It says the term pernicious anemia is now most commonly applied to a B12 deficiency resulting from a lack of intrinsic factor. Antibodies to intrinsic factor and parietal cells are common in patients with pernicious anemia, their relatives, and patients with other autoimmune disorders. So basically, that's just a complicated way of saying that the reason that your intrinsic factor isn't working is you have an autoantibody in your body that is acting against intrinsic factor, okay? So if that doesn't work, you don't absorb the B12, and you're probably gonna be getting B12 shots. All right, first full paragraph in the right-hand column on 674 says that a deficiency of vitamin B12 causes two major disorders, megaloblastic anemia and pernicious anemia, and these patients will have neurological disorders as well.
Is this the one that's also caused by if someone's had like a bariatric surgery?
Yes, yes, and it tells you that in the reading about that people that had those weight loss surgeries and basically any problems with your stomach whatsoever, a lot of times will have an effect on your intrinsic factor as well. It's kind of like a side effect of it. Yeah, Darren.
That makes sense because the stomach, when altered, will lose some of its ability to create the intrinsic factor.
Yes. Okay, if you'll go down from where we just were to a little bit, about halfway down further, it says the most common method for determination of vitamin B12, again, are the competitive protein binding radioimmunoassay test, RIAs. That's on page 674. If you'll go up about 10 lines from the very bottom, it states that. All right, the next vitamin that I want to talk about is on page 675 in the right-hand column. Now, I'm skipping two of them that's in your reading, but I want to talk about one of the more common ones. Actually, it's supposed to be like the most common discussed vitamin out of all of them, and I think it's one of the only ones we have remaining. It's called vitamin C, or ascorbic acid. Says this is the most commonly discussed vitamin. It says major dietary sources include fruits, vegetables, tomatoes, peppers, cabbage, green leafy vegetables, potatoes. It says ascorbic acid is important in the formation and stabilization of collagen. It goes on to state that the deficiency, toward the very bottom of that paragraph, it says the deficiency state of ascorbic acid or vitamin C is known as scurvy.
Yar.
You guys may associate that with sailors. Sailors used to get scurvy or Lyme disease. It says this is characterized by bleeding disorders, including swollen or bleeding gums and impaired wound healing, and even anemias could be from a vitamin C deficiency.
So if it ever floods, we have to plant an orange tree on our boat.
When you were mentioning sailors, you said some kind of disease. What was that
They
again?
call it, I think it's called Lyme's disease. It's in the very first of the chapter under vitamins. It goes on, it talks about each one of these deficiencies, but I think they call it Lyme's, and it goes with scurvy. Okay, one of your objectives also talks about the TPN, the total parenteral nutrition, and some of the things that's more commonly added to that. There's one thing I want you to highlight on page 679, and there's a reason for it. I just don't think, there's a lot of information in this chapter, okay? I'm more concerned about things like B12 folate and what you're gonna be adding to people that are on feeding tubes and stuff like that, because again, you guys aren't gonna be faced with that working in the lab. But, to answer one of the objectives, on page 679, if you'll drop down to about the 8th line, it says that copper and zinc are the most common trace elements that are added to parenteral nutrition solutions. And when we're talking about copper and zinc, we're talking about the minerals. You remember when I told you the micronutrients consist of vitamins and minerals? And we've talked about some of these things, like there are certain minerals that we have to have them in our body, but they have to be real small amounts. Copper and zinc are two of those minerals. The book also mentions a few others, but I just don't think that you will be tested on that for your registry, okay?
Isn't zinc like one of the minerals that they give you whenever like when they start birth control?
Say that again?
Isn't zinc one of the minerals that they give you when you start birth control?
That may be a question for Ms. Brigadis back there. Ask her, cause she probably can answer
And
that.
the zinc's one of the vital minerals that they give you when you start birth control.
Well, sometimes they do, but also really deep in prenatal.
They gave me folic acid. That's all it is.
Most prenatal ones contain folic acid. I don't remember which one it was.
Okay, guys, so bear with me, guys. We got about 3 more minutes and I'll give you guys a break on this. Some of these review questions toward the back. Let's see if we can answer some of these. Everybody with me on page 682? Okay, number 1, which of the following describes the correct source, function, and deficient state of the vitamin listed?
Oh,
Yes, a thiamine deficiency, basically, you get that from whole grains, and berry is the condition that goes with a thiamine deficiency. All right, number 2, think about this before you answer it. It says, which vitamin would be affected if a patient was diagnosed with a disorder involving fat absorption?
Vitamin
Okay,
K?
I wanna know why. Okay, I know A is correct, and I know why y'all all know that A is correct, because in this book, it's like it gives every multiple choice to answer
Because it's
A.
a fat soluble.
Yeah, it's fat soluble.
Yeah, because out of those vitamins that are listed there, the only one that's a fat soluble vitamin is A, right?
Yes.
So that has to be the answer.
They make all the answers.
Okay, number 4, it says a 70-year-old man presented to his physician with a broken arm. Lab work indicated an elevated PT, with all the other laboratory results being normal. the man was also taking an antibiotic for an earlier respiratory infection. Which, if any, of the following vitamins might be involved? What's that?
Vitamin D.
Nope, not D.
It's,
Why would it be vitamin K? Why are you answering that? I mean,
Because
why
of
you
the
do it?
antibiotics.
calcium absorption.
Well, it mentioned the proton was elevated, right? And we know if you're deficient in vitamin K, we talked about that's gonna elevate your proton, but then it also uses something in that case study that you need to be aware of. It says they're taking antibiotics.
Yeah.
What do antibiotics do?
destroy.
It
Kills your normal
it
flora.
kills bacteria, but it can also kill the normal flora that's considered good bacteria. Right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, number 7 says metabolic syndrome is a complex disorder with many parameters to measure. It says which of the following is not needed to assess a metabolic syndrome? So basically, like if you're trying to test, if you're testing somebody for metabolic syndrome, which has to do with malnutrition, which of these is not? Which of these doesn't match?
D.
And elevated blood pressure? Elevated blood pressure is not good. That could be a person that's not nourished,
Right.
okay? Which one is not, I mean, which one just doesn't make sense? C?
I would be, no.
A.
It would be A.
Oh,
Because it says an elevated HDL. That's what we want, is an
That's a good
elevated
thing, though.
HDL,
Oh,
right?
yeah.
Yes.
HDL is the good cholesterol, so
Sorry.
we want a high HDL. So that person would not have metabolic
Is
syndrome. They're in
not.
good health.
I'm
More
so
than
bad
mine.
about missing that in the question.
yeah.
How about that?
Okay, here's another one, number 8. Which of the following nutritional markers has been found to be the most sensitive and helpful indicator of nutritional status in very ill patients?
Would it
A,
be A?
because that's the pre-albumin.
Exactly. Albumin's half-life is too long. Transthyretin, and if you guys will, because I don't think that I probably put this on the test, put out beside transthyretin, another name for that is pre-albumin, because I know that's what you guys know it is. Pre-albumin. The half-life of pre-albumin is not near as long as the half-life of albumin. So if you're trying to assess someone's nutritional status, you would wanna do a test on something that has a very short half-life.
I think
Okay, and pre-albumin, the half-life is a lot shorter.
I think the book said it was 12 hours.
Yeah, there's a chart in your book, I'll tell you where it's at, it tells you what the half-life of that stuff is.
I remember underlining it.
That chart's on page 665, table 33, pack 1. Pre-albumin's half-life is 48 hours versus the albumin half-life, which is 20 days. Okay.
What did I underline?
Then I'm gonna let you guys do this one on your own, but there is a case study in this chapter that you need to be very aware of. And it is case study. Case study 33, Pack 3, it's on page 676.
Three.
So make sure you read over that and then you're able to answer those. If anybody has problems with it, you can get with me, or it should be on D2L answers.
33 tag. 3.
Well, it says in my book, it says 33.3.1.
Nope, just 33.3.
That's the
A
table,
27
case study
now?
table.
Yeah.
The actual case study is 33.3.
So the whole thing.
Okay, guys, let's take 15 minutes and we'll come back and I'll go over